Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with the Honourable Scott Morrison. He is the former Prime Minister of Australia. Prime Minister, we get to the segment where we get to talk a little bit about China, and I know you've got a lot to say on that. And obviously, the background is that China continues to push its agenda in Taiwan, South China Sea, and indeed elsewhere. Where do you see this going over the next few years?
I think we'll see it continue to play out as it has. I'm not expecting to see a lot of major change. The tensions are real. I think we're seeing investors, in particularly out of the West, in the US especially, start to pull back and divest and to de-risk, as they call it. We've seen that particularly in private equity and in terms of the inflows into China. That's really slowed right up to a trickle, if not a drought. And so I think that will continue as investors are now properly pricing the risk of their investment in China. We saw it here in Australia, where China applied economic coercion to our economy in trade, in a range of commodities, particularly in our wine sector, and they did in coal at one point. I mean, it's been more than 18 months, 20 months since the last election.
Right.
Apparently, relations have normalised, as they say it. Well, we stood up to them; they didn't like it. And yet they still have some of these transactions in place. So, their tactics have changed, and China's tactics will keep changing. They've moved away a bit from the wolf warrior diplomacy that I contended with.
Right.
But their strategy is the same. And so the West needs to continue to be quite resolved. I think Mike Gallagher's China committee in the US is doing some great work in just calling out the risks that are there and the actions that are needed. And I'd be saying, companies in Australia and Canada and elsewhere need to be very mindful, both of the risks of their involvement in China, and to price them properly, and to ensure that they're diversifying and not putting all their eggs in one basket. I've seen too often companies in Australia and elsewhere get intoxicated by what they think is the river of gold that will flow, but it comes at quite a price and at significant risk.
And indeed, there's so many different pressure points that the Chinese Communist Party uses. You mentioned some of them that you had to face when you were prime minister, and I'm sure cyber attacks was another aspect of it. Concerns about election interference and those kinds of things that Canada also faces. Can you describe that a little bit for our audience as well?
Sure. We acted across a whole range of fronts, and not just myself, but my predecessors as well. Making sure that they weren't building out our 5G network and get access to the Internet of Things in this country. New legislation which was dealing with political interference to block what we still see. But that legislation and regulation needs to be kept current to deal with all the new and different ways that infiltration is sought. On the cybersecurity, well, we all had to bump up on that front, both in the corporate sector and in the government sphere. And it's important to keep both of those in mind. It's not just about what governments need to do. Western corporate targets are real as well,
right.
For not just China, but Russia and Iran as well, which we saw. So need to be mindful of that. And so I think for companies around the world, understanding this geopolitical environment, the risks and how it impacts on them is a very new set of challenges, I think, for CEOs and fund managers around the world. So, I'll be leaving politics at the end of this month, Tony, and
I heard that.
And I'll be moving more into that space. It's working with Robert O'Brien at American Global Strategies, and as well as on some global advisory awards, and another one with Mike Pompeo. So these are two gentlemen who know the space pretty well, and I'm looking forward to doing more with them. But understanding that China's not mucking around,
right?
And the potential returns some may think are there can come at great vulnerability and risk, not just to your own your own company, but to your country as well.
Indeed. And thank you for your service in Parliament. And I know you are moving on, and best of success with that. We've got about 30 seconds before the next break. Do you think corporate Australia understands the risks now?
I think they do much more than they did, and because they've been they've been the targets of these attacks themselves.
Right.
And so I think there has been a diversification, which we were very pleased to lead when we were in government. Trade deals with the UK and India. We lifted as a government over 9 years, of which I was Prime Minister for around 4, all of our trade agreements to new levels, which meant our companies could diversify. I think that's important for all Western countries to make sure they have a healthy diversity in where their corporates are doing business, so as to not create dependency and vulnerability.
Indeed. Prime Minister, we're going to take another brief break. Hang in there with us, and we'll be back after these short messages.